Hello. In this video I'm going to talk about charity shops. And I suppose I should start off by saying why I want to talk about charity shops. In London, and this video will be based on London, it won't apply so much to other parts of England where the pressures may be different, and it certainly won't apply to America where there are thrift shops and bookshops are still thriving, apparently, or Australia where they've got the opportunity shops. So what am I finding in London? Basically, if I look at perhaps the last 3 years, I've probably bought 80–90% of the books that I've bought from charity shops. They are the only area where it is still feasible to find books at a reasonable price. And even though the prices have been shooting up in charity shops recently, there are still bargains to be had. Now, in London, there always used to be a lot of used bookshops, and there still are some. They haven't totally gone. But in terms of relative numbers, charity shops have expanded. And indeed, I know probably at least 8 charity bookshops. So charities have moved into book selling and expanded it. And so I felt I needed to say something about charity shops. Second reason I quite like to talk about this is that I've done 2 long stints as a volunteer in charity shops. Now I'm not going to talk too much about that in this video, though I might do a separate one briefly talking about my own experiences as a volunteer. So, because of that history, I do take an interest in charity shops and how they operate and what I think they do well and what I think they do badly. And finally, on YouTube, a few days ago, I watched a video by Antique Central. Now, this was about charity shops, but I don't think they mentioned books once. But a lot of what they said had elements that I could relate to and accept. So that is why I'd like to talk about charity shops. I will just pause the video while I gather my... Before I talk a bit more about charity shops and that video, perhaps I should say a little bit about the history of charity shops. And it does vary slightly, the dates, depending on exactly what your definition of a charity shop is. I have read some reports that the first charity shop in England appeared in 1899. But I've seen other reports that talked about charity shops and stalls and fundraising efforts going back far further. The generally accepted start of charity, or major increase in charity shops, occurred in 1941 when the British Red Cross opened some charity shops. And if I just look at the figure, by 1945 there were something like 200 charity shops run by the British Red Cross. Some of them were temporary, and I don't know the exact history. And then Oxfam started opening shops in the 1950s, I believe, or about that time. And gradually the numbers have increased steadily pretty much since then. As for charity bookshops, I couldn't find any definitive history about them. I did see something that said they were started appearing in the 1980s, which fits in to some extent with my experience. I do remember shopping in one regularly in the 1990s, so certainly quite feasible that they started in the 1980s. So that is a very brief, short history of when they started. Now, one of the subjects in the video that I mentioned, and I will put a link in the description, was about cost pressures. And I think that is an area that's worth looking at. So what I will start by saying is, in the original, when the charity shops first started, they faced the same costs to a large extent as other book dealers, two main differences being that they had their goods donated. So they got donations, they didn't have to pay for the shop. And secondly, they survived by using volunteers. So they weren't having to pay for staff as most used bookshops had to. So that was the initial situation. So they already started off in a good place. But then politics intervened. In 1988, the government allowed local authorities to grant discretionary rate relief. It wasn't mandatory at that time, but a number of authorities granted rate relief to charity shops. And then I'm looking at my notes. And I'm thinking, I think it may have been 1993, the government made discretionary rate relief mandatory for charity shops, and they got 80% relief that was mandatory. And local councils, if they wanted to, could make that up to 100%. So that was a significant advantage to the charity shops. Were there other advantages? Well, the next one I can think of was rents. Now, this didn't apply to all charity shops, but many local authorities owned commercial properties, and also some of the big commercial companies that own properties, if they had an empty shop unit, rather than rent them free or cheaply to businesses, would choose to rent them to charity shops. They didn't want to encourage the impression that businesses could negotiate significantly lower rents, so they limited, to a large extent, the gift of lower rents to charity shops. So another bonus for them. And then, my apologies if I get the date wrong because I can't see it on my notes, I think in about 2003 or something like that, the government allowed charities to claim back tax. So basically, if donors gave their goods to the charity shop as gift aid, the charities could claim an extra 25%, or it may have been different at the start, I'm not certain, but they could claim back extra money from the government. So that was another step in giving charity shops an edge. Now, bookshops still survive. They had the specialist knowledge, which perhaps the charity shops didn't. But gradually, at least in London, may not be as true elsewhere in Britain, but certainly in London, I reckon the number of used bookshops gradually decreased and the number of charity bookshops increased. So over that era, charity shops gradually got a better and better position. And I shall pause it again briefly. And then the next sort of major change that affected both used bookshops and charity shops was the internet. Now, I had a look online. As far as I can see, ABE Books formed in 96, Bookfinder 97, Biblio in 2000, World of Books in 2002. So basically, traders started to appear to try and grip a part of the market. So both charity and bookshops faced competition. I'm not certain when eBay started, sorry, I didn't research that, but that was also around. Now, obviously, book dealers could build their own internet sites. They could sell on these platforms. So it wasn't a total disadvantage, but I'm sure it had an impact. So again, I shall pause. Right, I shall now get back to the gist of the video that I watched, which is that basically charity shops, one of the purposes, certainly one that I believe in, is that they support local communities. They provide hubs for recycling goods. They provide services to the local community. And certainly the second charity shop that I worked for had a massive book section. And I'll talk about that in a separate video if I choose to do so. But basically, charities often were locally based, local causes, perhaps local hospital serving or donating funds to local hospitals, to hospices, and providing aid locally. But perhaps like ordinary retail shops, charities wanted to expand. So perhaps like supermarkets causing greengrocers and butchers and others to shut. Basically, charities expanded and the bigger ones tended to survive. Some of the smaller ones became slightly less common. And basically, a bigger charity tends then to have head offices, has CEOs, income managers, and senior staff who basically often have nothing to do with the local community. They're brought in supposedly for their business skills, and some of them are highly paid. So the original ethos of some of the charity shops has weakened in my view. I always felt local charity shops, as well as serving the main charitable aim of the charity should also serve the local community. And one of the things that sort of always upset me is that these charity shops often operate fixed pricing policies. Some will set a price for something, and if it doesn't sell, it gets recycled. It's no longer available to the local community. Now, I worked in a bookshop where, because we had the space, we used to price all the books at what we thought could be achieved. But if they didn't sell in a sort of month or 2 months, we'd halve the price. And then we'd halve it again. We even had a section for bookcases where we used to do, they could buy 4 for £1. And that, to me, is the true recycling format. But some of these big businesses now, if a book doesn't sell, it goes straight off to World of Books, and it's not held in the local community for the benefit of the local community. And if you buy from these dealers, you'll end up paying postage, admittedly quite cheap, and the book will be a lot cheaper than it would have been in the charity shop. So combined, it's probably, you're paying as much as if you bought it at full price in the charity shop. There's no or limited chance of prices being reduced. Again, a pause. And the final thing I'm going to talk about in terms of charity shops is the resellers. A lot of charity shops realised that people were going round their shops, checking things on the internet, buying them to resell. Now, that is partly a failure on the charity shop side, of failing to recognise the true value of items that they sell. And generally, some of the shops are really good at recognising that value, but some aren't. And basically, the senior people in charity shops saw that there was income they were missing out on that was being gobbled up by the resellers. So a lot of the charity shops, and especially the bookshops now, check the prices of nearly every book. They research, and basically the bargains have disappeared. Now, part of this pricing is driven up by cost pressures. Basically, rents have gone up, staffing costs have gone up. Most charity shops tend to have 1 or 2 permanent staff and perhaps 4 or 5 volunteers, maybe more. But they do have to pay wages and have the administration. And of course, if they're paying extra to those staff, they pay more to the chief executive, the income manager, the etc., etc. So basically, while I accept charity shops have more costs to recover, so do bookshops. But basically, given that they avoid some of the costs that bookshops have and they get their stock free, I sometimes find it a little bit unacceptable in terms of how they price. So, I don't know whether you've enjoyed this. I don't know whether you call it a waffle or a moan, but I feel I have to rely on charity shops to find more books for my collection. But the bargains are not there anymore. I basically never bought to sell on. I have sold on occasionally over the years when I've upgraded copies, but I don't move outside my genre. I only buy within my genre, by and large, unless it's something I particularly want to read, or if it's something on local history that I find interesting. But generally, I am not a reseller. I don't buy to resell. That's not to say that if I saw a first of Harry Potter or something, that I wouldn't buy it. But by and large, I do not look to buy outside of my genre. And it is frustrating that the resellers have basically pushed charity shops to research prices, push prices up. And a lot of that has been driven by the internet, all the apps, all the options for selling. Because obviously people have books now, rather than donating, can research the price and sell themselves. So I find that opportunities that I have for buying and collecting science fiction have dried up significantly over the years. That's it for me. I hope you enjoyed. That's me signing off.